So I was actually looking through the Analogue project on Instagram where you have documented the processes really well. And it just got me interested about the context of the project and where your impulse to kind of create a dark room for printmakers comes from. So if you could just walk us a little bit through the space, the impulses, the curatorial impulses, and the process that preceded a community of printmakers coming together in the darkroom.
Okay, well, I think the idea was to really bring in analog practitioners, photographers, artists who've actually worked with film, and to get them to print in the darkroom. And the thing is, a lot of them actually had never printed. So it was also a space for me to teach them how to print. Throughout the 6 months that we had this workshop, this project, we basically invited people to come in. Every month we had a few people come in where we would actually take the negatives and would make a small edit and then work with those images to make prints. Now, the idea was to get them to actually try to make their own prints, but also to show them various ways to make prints. And what was interesting was some of them also already had existing images from those negatives. So what was fun was to come up with our own idea what an image looks like. So we weren't sticking to the traditional way of printing. We were coming up with our own ideas of how we would like the image to be. And that made it really interesting because it was a sort of very free space to make prints.
Where the darkroom was situated, and how did you bring the community of photographers together for the project?
Okay, so the darkroom is basically in our friend's studio in Delhi. And it's an existing darkroom that was there. So I went in and I kind of fixed it up and really made it very functional. There were a lot of things missing, so we just had to make it work and had to order chemicals. And the idea was that we'd make our own chemicals to develop with. It's actually, you can also buy pre-existing chemicals, but it's actually fun to make our own. And the artists that we brought in were basically all from Delhi. They're people that we knew, they're friends of friends. And initially the idea was to bring in photographers from outside of Delhi. But because of the lockdown, that wasn't possible. So we started looking within Delhi and seeing who was there who had actually worked with film, or who had negatives. People who had negatives at home, family archives, their own personal work. We actually brought them in to work with. And ideally, in an ideal situation, we would have brought people in from various cities, but it just wasn't possible in those 6 months.
Right, because of the lockdown and other restrictions that came with it. Right. So you're saying that the artists brought their family albums and other assorted material that they then started developing in the darkroom?
Yeah, for someone like Sukanya, she had a family archive. She brought that in. Someone else had their own work that they had shot over the years. So it was a sort of a mix. Someone had found images, and so we printed from that. So it was a very different range of images, and it was really exciting to work with those and work with some very difficult images, work with very easy negatives. So it's also good access for me to go get back in the darkroom and start making prints.
This whole process of printmaking also involves so much patience in the sense that you have to wait for the print to develop. So there's this thrill of anticipation that a lot of the artists have talked about in the documentation process, right? So I'm also wondering if there were any significant losses or errors in the process, and if you could just walk us through a couple of works maybe that you can think of.
Okay, so I mean, there's always a loss. I think the thing is when you start printing, even when I make my own prints, as you're testing each negative out, you lose images, you lose paper, because you're trying to get the right exposure, the right contrast. So it's basically, yeah, you do need a lot of patience to get to the right point. So when I've made my own prints for my own negatives, even though very familiar with it, when you start printing, it takes a while to get to that point. And you know that that's going to happen. That's just the nature of making prints in the darkroom. So, okay, so if I go back to Sukanya's work, with Sukanya, what happened was she had brought in her family archive, and there were photographs of her grandparents. And she also already had images from from when they were first printed from the 30s and 40s. Now, we started to make prints that looked like those images. And so obviously we lost paper, we lost a lot of material trying to make those images. And actually both of us weren't very pleased with them. And we said, let's try our own version of it, how we'd want it to look. And that's what made it really exciting, because there was a sense of freedom to reimagine the image. You know, we weren't stuck with what it should look like. We wanted to just make it like what we thought we would like to bring out from the image. And that was exciting.
Could you give us maybe one or two examples of a particular image, if that's possible?
Yeah, so there was a double so Sukani had some 4x5s and some other smaller negatives. So we basically made a double exposure. So what we did is we put one image into the enlarger and we put one image on top of the paper, and we made double exposures from it. Now, what was exciting was that both the images are very different contrasts, different tones, different textures. And so we played around to kind of make a collage, essentially. Rather than sticking both negatives in the enlarger itself, we wanted to put one down on the paper to get the impression of that on the paper and one in the negative carrier. And then we played around with that, and it gave really beautiful results. And I think she's actually used that in her exhibition that she's doing right now.
So I also see then that there was an impulse to replicate something, and then you decided to experiment instead. And did that hold true for all the artists who came together in the studio? Or was it a matter of developing prints in tandem with how they might have looked before?
No, I think we really wanted to make it how we thought it should look like. We were trying to get away from the idea of how it looked before. Even with when, like, for example, Anshika Varma, she brought in some negatives of hers. We played around with different images, and I basically said that I have an idea of how this image should look like. And she had also very specific ideas of how the image should look. So I basically said to her, look, let me make my version and see what you think of it. And so we also made a version of how she would have liked to have seen it. Just to sort of compare and see how both images would look. And then we kind of figured out which one worked better. Then we made multiple prints of it. So it was also like, it's basically a collaboration, right? I mean, it's not just me making the prints, but it's also about how they envision the image to look. And so it was basically a lot of experimentation. And that's really the fun part of it. It's not just me taking control of saying, oh, I'm going to make this image and I'm going to make this print very contrasty or very flat. And this is how you should look at it. It's also about them having an idea of what they want to see from it. Sometimes they'd say, well, I want to bring something out from the shadows. I want to see more contrast. I was like, okay. I would say, look, I don't think that works, but let's do it. So at least if you haven't printed before, at least you'll also learn how a print should look or not look. And that was what was exciting about it. Because in the process of actually printing and then looking at various versions, it's also a learning process for me and for them.
And because it's a learning process and there were so many experimentations in the darkroom, I'm also wondering if there were errors or just marks of damage or age on the photographs that were accommodated. So could you comment a little bit about just the nature and process of image making, and how you can't do away with certain marks of age and damage, and you kind of incorporate that in this revised version of making an image or reimagining an image? Well,
I mean, the thing is, the prints that we're not making on archival paper. We're making on resin coated paper. And yeah, there is damage because, as we process and as the image goes to the developer, the fixer, you try to maintain the longevity of it by washing it very well, trying to make a very clean image. But you do know that as images are stored, and depending how they're stored, they are going to get damaged. I mean, if you look at archival images that my parents have, or say, for example, Sukani has, they've just been damaged over time, just because of the way they've been stored. And you do realize that the images that we made through this process, they will see the mark of time down the road. And that's just the nature of these images. I mean, if we had printed on fiber paper, and if we had done it in a very archival way, you know that they would last maybe 100 years, 150 years. But as you print now, you imagine them to maybe last 50 years, 60 years, maybe 80. Then it's not a forever process. And some of these images will get damaged within the week, within the next 2 weeks. But that's just nature of printing. There are going to be imperfections. You know, there's scratches in the image, there's scratches on the paper. That just happens, and you just learn to live with it. I mean, obviously, if you're doing for an exhibition, you do, make sure that everything's done as clean as possible. But the idea is also about experimentation and chance, and you just learn to live with those flaws.
Just one more question, and I don't know if it's important to the process in the darkroom or not, but if it is, I'd love for you to comment a little bit on it, which is that did you have any preferences in terms of producing color photographs or color prints or grayscale prints?
Well, the thing is, the darkroom only allows us to print black and white. Color is not possible in this darkroom, only because to print color, you need very specific chemicals, and you need them to be very high temperature. And I haven't printed color in a long time. And there's a specific machine also that you need to print in color, which we don't have. And I've never enjoyed printing in color because when you print in a darkroom, it has to be completely black, and you can't have any safety light or any light coming in whatsoever. And I've never been comfortable with that sort of space. At least with black and white, you can have the safety light on, and you can see where things are, where the objects are, where the sink is, where the enlargers, where the trays are, where the easel is. And I've always preferred that process. Also because I know that I can print black and white very well. It's one skill that I feel like I have. Interestingly, you see a lot of photographers know very different processes. They are very good at alternative processes. And as much as I would like to learn it, I resist because I know black and white, I know how to print, and I feel very comfortable in the darkroom space. And so I've always stuck to making it better and better for myself.
Have you imagined this project taking shape in the future? Like, of course, we have the lockdown restrictions all over again, but even without that in mind, do you think this project could take shape through a different community of photographers, or just any iteration of it that you possibly have imagined for it?
Yeah, and it's funny you asked that, because the thing is, over the last many months, I've been thinking about how to work with other artists. And I really feel like as there's fewer resources out there, I would like to work with one photographer, say like one photographer a month, and say, look, let's bring in a body of your work. We do an edit together, and we make a set of prints. We don't just make prints that are sort of experimental. We make final prints. We make prints that are exhibition quality. So in a way, we spend 10 days over these images, and we make prints, as many versions as we need to get to the final image. And we work on that as a collaboration, not as something that I feel the image should look like, but something that the artist feels that they want to see from the image. So not just like make 1 or 2 images, but maybe a dozen images that you can see actually on the wall and say, this is like exhibition quality. That's one thing that I would like to do with artists. The other thing is, as fewer and fewer resources out there, and as there's fewer funds for photographers, I want to be able to create a space where I can teach, say, 3 photographers every month how to print and process in the darkroom. In the past, I've done workshops, and I realized that photographers don't have funds to take these classes. So I want to be able to create a space where I can invite 3 photographers in every month and say, look, I'm going to spend a week with you. We're going to shoot film. We're going to process the film, and then we'll print. And I want to be able to teach them this over the course of a week or 10 days. And sort of make it a very democratic space. And I want to be able to figure out a way to do that down the road.
Great. I think that gives me a very good idea of the Analogue project overall, and just the process that entailed its duration.